Hey everyone, today, let's dive into the story of the Maccabean Revolt, which happened between 167 and 160 BCE. This was a major Jewish uprising in Judea against the Seleucid Empire's rule. At the forefront of the revolt was a country priest named Mattathias, and his band of fighters eventually became known as the Maccabees. Now, what's super interesting is that this revolt was a success. Not only did they capture Jerusalem, but they also reclaimed and purified the Temple of Jerusalem. And if you've ever heard of Hanukkah, that's where the tradition comes from. It commemorates this very moment in Jewish history. Let's rewind a bit to get some background. After Alexander the Great's death, his massive empire got split up into 4 different kingdoms during what's called the Wars of the Diadochi. The main players here were Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, the Kingdom of Pergamon, and Macedon, which included Greece. For a while, Judea was under the rule of Egypt, led by Ptolemaic, and things were relatively peaceful. The Jews in Jerusalem could continue practicing their religion without much interference, and in the 3rd century BCE, Judaism was thriving under Ptolemaic rule. But by the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucids gained control over Judea, and things started to shift. The Seleucids were also trying to expand their influence over Egypt, and part of their plan included bringing Judea under their thumb. At this time, Jerusalem's society was deeply intertwined with both religion and politics. The Jewish aristocracy, particularly the priests and high priests, were at the top of the social structure, while the rest of the region had embraced Hellenism, which was the Greek way of life that spread after Alexander's conquests. Many Jews held fast to their own traditions and practices. Even though Hellenism was all around them, they largely ignored it and were allowed to continue their way of life under the Ptolemaic rulers. The Ptolemies respected the Jewish people and even granted them civil rights. Life under Ptolemaic rule was stable, and at the center of it all was the Second Temple of Jerusalem. This was the heart of the Jewish community, both socially and religiously. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was also a symbol of God's presence among them, and that feeling of being the chosen people was central to their identity. Then, in 198 BCE, everything changed when the Seleucid Empire defeated the Ptolemies and took over Judea. The Seleucids, especially under their king Antiochus III, were big on Hellenism and had already been spreading Greek culture and religion across their empire. Now that they controlled Jerusalem, they tried to do the same with the Jewish population. Antiochus wanted to erase any trace of Judaism that made it distinct from Greek culture. A lot of Jews felt the pressure to conform and accept Hellenism because it came with certain benefits, like being part of a larger, more economically integrated Greek world. But things really took a turn for the worse when Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus III, came to power. He took his father's idea of Hellenization and cranked it up a notch. Antiochus Epiphanes saw himself as a future legend, wanting his name to stand alongside figures like Alexander the Great. To achieve that, he figured he needed to fully enforce Greek culture on the Jewish population, which hadn't happened yet. He even accepted a bribe and appointed Jason of the Oniot family as the new high priest, which was a big deal. Jason, with his new power, built a gymnasium just outside the temple. This was a symbol of Greek culture, right in the heart of the Jewish world. Here's the thing, in Greek culture, people were supposed to be naked in the gymnasium, which directly went against Jewish laws that forbid public nudity. This was a clear message from the state that Greek culture was now the dominant force. In fact, it became a legal requirement for anyone who could afford it to visit the gymnasium at least once. This was one way the Seleucid regime was trying to show that Greek culture, and by extension the state, was greater than any religion, including Judaism. Some Jews started to fall in line and adapt to the regime, giving up parts of their religion. Encouraged by his success with the gymnasium, Antiochus Epiphanes pushed even harder. After putting down a short-lived rebellion, his stance against Judaism grew even more aggressive. He desecrated the temple, vandalized it, and even placed an idol on the altar. He made it illegal to practice certain Jewish customs like circumcision and observing the Sabbath. Greek altars and idols popped up in every town, and those who refused to abandon Judaism were executed. And the persecution of the Jewish people under Antiochus was intense. Even though some Jews had adopted Hellenistic culture by this point, the harsh oppression and attempts to destroy their religion really united the Jewish community in Judea. They needed someone to step up and lead them, and that's where Mattathias comes in. He was a local priest, living in the town of Modine, and things got heated when Antiochus sent his officers there to enforce his oppressive laws. Mattathias was told to make the first sacrifice to an idol, but he outright refused. And when another Jewish man stepped up to do it, Mattathias took matters into his own hands. He killed the officer and destroyed the idol. After that, he famously called out to the people, saying something like, "If you're zealous for the law and the covenant, follow me." This moment was a rallying cry, and Mattathias, along with his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Jonathan, became the leaders the Jewish people had been waiting for. In 167 BCE, under their leadership, the Jewish people rose up against the Seleucid forces. The family of Mattathias would soon become known as the Maccabees, which means the hammer, and for good reason. They started recruiting tough, loyal followers and launched a guerrilla war, hitting the Seleucids in the northern villages of Judea. They were tearing down pagan altars and going after those who worshipped the idols, even targeting some Hellenized Jews who had turned away from their faith. Unfortunately, Mattathias passed away in 166 BCE. But before he died, he left Judah Maccabee in charge. At first, Antiochus underestimated the rebellion, thinking he could squash it with smaller forces. But Judah Maccabee turned out to be a brilliant military leader and made quick work of the Seleucid generals. Antiochus looked foolish as his armies kept losing, and in response, he decided to go all in. He sent his top general, Lysias, with 60,000 soldiers to crush the Jewish resistance. Judah's forces were severely outnumbered, but they had one big advantage: they knew the land. Using the hills and their knowledge of the terrain, Judah's army outmaneuvered the Seleucids and picked them off bit by bit. Then came the big showdown. Judah had about 7,000 fighters, but they were up against an army 5 times larger. According to the story, Judah prayed for victory, and despite the odds, the Jewish army pulled off an incredible victory, devastating Antiochus' forces. After that, Judah's army marched on Jerusalem, and the Seleucids were in no shape to resist. They were driven out of the city, and once again, Jerusalem was in Jewish hands. When Judah and his brothers reached the temple, they were heartbroken by the destruction and desecration they saw. The temple had been defiled, and it took months of hard work to restore it. Finally, on December 25, 165 BCE, the temple was rededicated to God, and the Jewish people celebrated for 8 days. This event is still remembered today as Hanukkah. But the Maccabees weren't done yet. They had won their religious freedom, but now they were pushing for political independence too. While some Jews still had reservations about the Maccabees' growing influence and the Hellenistic culture that had already taken root, the Maccabees managed to conquer all of Judea. By the time the Seleucid kingdom collapsed in Palestine and Antiochus VII died in 129 BCE, the Jewish people were finally free from foreign rule. Although all of Mattathias' sons had died by 134 BCE, with Simon being the last of them, their legacy lived on. The Maccabees had established the Hasmonean dynasty, a Jewish ruling family that governed an independent Judea for a generation. It was a major victory for the Jewish people, both for their faith and their political future. This period would go on to have a significant impact on Jewish history, especially in Jerusalem in the centuries that followed.